further ado, I'd just like to welcome our guest today. So I often think, we did a little outline of who this person is in the Eventbrite, but I always think it's fun to put people on the spot and let them do a little bit of a self intro. Would you be comfortable with that, Laura?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's like, thanks for putting me on the spot, Nick. As ever, I'm sure everybody else here has had that moment happen to them as well. So yeah. So should I just get started? Is that cool?
Yeah, tell us who you are.
Yeah, cool. So wow, I'm amazed how many people are here today, and I'm just so delighted that it seems like such a diverse range of folk. So my name's Laura Griffin. I am the director of Griffin and Co, although it wasn't always so, if that makes sense, until about a year ago. I started my own business and my own consultancy. But my background, so my connections with AAI is that originally when I first graduated from Edinburgh College of Art in illustration, I went into an internship, and that was my first kind of entrepreneurial but also kind of first career experience, if that makes sense. And I went to work with a startup which is no longer in existence, but actually from that experience I learned so much, which was really insightful for me. I worked in a social enterprise which was also food related, called Feast Community. So for me, you know, my journey has been very, as Nick knows personally, it's been very varied and different and diverse in so many ways. I think maybe that's just the nature of how a lot of graduates are now, compared to what maybe traditionally would have been the case of graduating from university and going straight into a job, and you know, you would be in that job for like 10 years. I've probably changed jobs so much, if that makes sense, and worked in so many different industries now. So for me, you know, starting my own consultancy, about a year ago, if that makes sense, I've kind of amalgamated all the knowledge and experiences that I've had to start up my own business, I suppose, about a year ago. So now I'm running a kind of strategic creative consultancy, and sort of all that insight and knowledge that I've built up over the last few years, I guess, from graduating. I graduated in 2014. I've been able to kind of find my own methods and my own tactics of dealing with client problems and helping solve those problems in different kinds of ways. My background's in design, and well, I studied illustration, and I feel like from illustration, I kind of translated a lot of my knowledge from storytelling, because illustration is about word and kind of visuals, I suppose, together. And for me, I've just kind of translated that sort of skill set into a completely different area, but they are still connected in different kinds of ways. So yeah, so I'm excited to talk about it with lots of different people today, so it should be great.
Well, let's get into it then, because one of the reasons I wanted to get you along here is because you've got this very creative, traditional degree, and what you've been able to do within 7 years and everything underneath that, all the different experiences, are really an interesting reflection of what the job market is like for young people and the kinds of opportunities that are out there if you seek it out. To give it a bit of context myself, I think I'm a bit older than you, Laura, and when I was at high school, I went to the careers advisor, and the extent of the consultation was, Nick, you're doing really well at history, so what university are you going to? And I said, Glasgow. So I went there, and I was there for 4 years. I got a degree that I didn't really want. I hated every minute of it to the last moment. I couldn't grow my beard long enough to be taken seriously as a historian. I still can't. I could grow it long enough to be taken seriously in the coffee business. So for 10 years during and after that time, I worked in the coffee business. And through that experience in hospitality and retail, I learned a lot about myself and what was common sense to me. And that gave me the confidence to go and get a 1-year postgraduate degree when I was 30 in marketing, because I knew that what was common sense for me was something other people would pay me for if I got that bit of paper. And I think that realization of who you are and your skill set is something I really want to dig into with you. So with all that being said, let's talk a little bit about your experience as a graduate, an arts graduate, and looking for a job then, because I think the meme, the kind of narrative now is like, you got an arts degree, what do you do unless you open your own art gallery? So how did you feel at the time when you got that bit of paper?
it's really funny because I think now there's a lot of creative graduates that are now going into food hospitality, which I think is amazing. I think like if you live in Glasgow or Edinburgh anyways, I feel like a lot of people who work in the hospitality industries have like switched, if that makes sense, into opening up, you know, a hospitality business or working in kind of lifestyle and branding. And I actually think that food and art has a lot of connections in it, if that makes sense, which is quite interesting. So it's just, you know, when you talk about your kind of coffee background there, you know, but you do, I think, just kind of talking about soft skills, if that makes sense. Like it's funny, you're talking about careers advisor. So I don't think I've ever told you this, Nick, actually, just to let everybody else here know, but I actually left school really, really young. I left school at 14 and had no standard grades or hires. So I'm kind of unusual in that sense. I left school really, really, really early. And I think that was due to feeling kind of like a bit of an outsider. I'm from Dundee originally, and I'm half Chinese and I'm half Scottish. And I think I always felt a little bit of an outcast, I think, at school, just due to like kind of like my racial background. And I think that's really important to talk about. Culturally, you know, I don't think that I felt like university was a choice for me, which is ironic because I know that within Chinese families, you know, university is like the biggest thing, you know, and they want you to go into being a traditional thing, which is like being a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. The creative industries isn't seen as a professional, you know, option for usually in Asian families anyways. So it's slightly different. But I guess for me, you know, like when I decided to go to college, I went to college first before I went to university. So I actually studied business to begin with, and I did an HNC and an HND in business. And I knew I had an interest in those areas, if that makes sense. But then I knew I was also quite a visual person. And in fact, like when I left my business studies and I was like, I think at that time I was just too young. I was like 17 or 18 when I went to college to study business. And I think I was always like quite a hands-on person. I wanted to make things and I wanted to like visualize things, and doing my business studies didn't really give me that option, if that makes sense. But it did give me that option of like, you know, learning about like problem solving, I suppose, in a way. And actually the two things kind of connect for me, where the creative side kind of came into play of like solving problems, you know, in a different kind of context. So the same kind of goes again, you know, I ended up doing a portfolio. I was really, really lucky. I got accepted into Edinburgh College of Art. Sometimes I wonder, and I know it sounds really bad to put it this way, but I guess when I got to Edinburgh University, it was a bit of a shock for me because I was like the only person from Dundee. I kind of, not that I'm saying I come from like a lower class background, if that makes sense. My mom is very working class and my dad is kind of like middle class. So my background is quite mixed, you know, culturally, my identity, and even just, you know, socially is like quite mixed up, if that makes sense. So I think it was a really big shock to my system when I got to university, and I was kind of like, whoa, everybody in my year is like from, you know, like there was hardly any Scottish people, if that makes sense. And that really threw me in a quite different, you know, really threw me out of comfort zone, if that makes sense as well. So, you know, it was a really unusual setting. But I mean, obviously everybody's starting from the same level when you're in university. We're all, you know, I started from first year, so it was like kind of like a mixed year where everybody gets to experiment with different, in art school anyways, it's very much like the first year is very much just trying to find out what direction you want to go in and what area you want to specialize in. I knew that I wanted to specialize, like I'd actually done a fine art portfolio, if that makes sense, to get into university to begin with, but I knew I wasn't really like really arty, if that makes sense. Like fine art is very much, you know, like I would say like a lot more cultural, whereas I think I wanted to go in the direction of more visual communication and design. And for me, that felt like it's a quite different purpose, if that makes sense. I think art is more making stuff for yourself and then presenting it to other people, whereas design is about creating things for others. So it is a quite different I would say if you were considering art or design, you know, as a career choice, that's generally, I would say, like it's quite a different, you know, way of thinking, I suppose. So yeah, I mean, during university it was quite challenging for me in so many ways, because it was just like culturally it was quite different. Background wise, it was quite different. I also worked 2 jobs like whilst I was in university. So I worked doing some freelance stuff, but then I also worked in retail as well. And I also organized a lot of my own internships because, you know, there was a lot of, I guess I just knew that when I came out of university that I wouldn't have, I suppose, like, it's really challenging because it's such a competitive market to work in the creative spaces anyways. The creative industry is really, really competitive. And actually, most of the time I found, as I got older, obviously, it's about kind of creating your own opportunities, in fact. And I think there is a level of entrepreneurial, like, there's an entrepreneurial mindset that maybe should be taught more in the creative education or academic backgrounds, actually, a little bit, rather than just being quite complacent and just thinking, okay, I've been given these briefs or I've got to solve this brief, but actually just thinking about what kind of context that I would want to put it in. So that kind of came quite naturally to me, I suppose, as a process.
Well, this is something that we really champion in AAI, is the idea that opportunities are taken rather than given, and it's about people, you know, getting after something themselves and getting outside of their comfort zone. So I'm fascinated to hear about how that realization of, right, this is art and this is design, and art is something for yourself, design is something people will pay me for. How did that translate to when you graduated and started looking for things? You mentioned there you started creating your own opportunities, started freelancing and putting yourself out. So was that already you dabbling with the boundaries of your comfort zones before you became a job seeker then?
Yeah, I guess the thing is with illustration, I don't know if it's still like this now, but around the time when I studied illustration, illustration was very much about self-branding, like personal branding, very much from the get-go, because you had to have a certain kind of aesthetic, if that makes sense. And it was very much encouraged. And this is like at the beginning of like social media, if that makes sense, you know, like people had just started to kind of emerge onto digital platforms at that time. I mean, like I said, I started university in 2010 and graduated in 2014. So, you know, Instagram, for example, was just in its infancy. Nobody was really adopting it at that time. And it's really interesting because digital was something that kind of grew with me as well. Sorry, I didn't really mention that earlier, because now I would say that digital is like the biggest part of like the services that I offer to people. And learning that structure really came from my first internship with AAI, actually. So, you know, when I graduated, and I guess like, you know, coming out of university, it was quite challenging. I actually went to do an internship in Hong Kong for 6 months, which was self-initiated. Basically, I went out to look out for my own opportunities. And half the time, what I discovered is that a lot of organizations just really don't have the time to advertise for an intern, or they don't have time to advertise for entry-level jobs. They're usually flat out, or they're not even considering it, which is a shame. Maybe that's changing now a little bit more, I think, where people are trying to give people their first opportunity. But actually, when I graduated, there was still like often that these companies are not thinking about that kind of level or entry level, if that makes sense. So even when I was in university and just kind of talking about looking for opportunities is, you know, I went and did an internship in New York, actually, but I was really lucky because there was a girl in the year above me and she'd gone to New York the year before and I applied for the same company, but I just did it as a self-initiative thing. And again, it was just because like at that time I'd faced some, I'm going to sound totally privileged here, which sounds terrible, but it's because I got turned down to do exchange in Massachusetts. I'd been actually accepted by MassArt, but because of that time, Edinburgh University and Edinburgh College of Art were merging together. There was like this big displacement with exchanges and things like that. But I knew that that was something I really wanted to do, and I wanted to really go out there and achieve it, regardless of the fact that there was like things like holding me back from doing that, if that makes sense. And so I still went ahead and did it. I just did it in a different kind of way. So there was, you know, sorry, I know I'm kind of gravitating back to university a little bit here, but I suppose when I graduated and then, you know, going into my first kind of internship, and, you know, I think I went in, I'm trying to remember what my title was. I think I was kind of like a visual communications assistant or something like that. So it was like a mix. I don't know if that role was really fully formed. It was one lady that was running this startup at the time, and she had come from a really kind of corporate background, but kind of dipping her toe into kind of entrepreneurial kind of, you know, businesses, if that makes sense. And it was really interesting, you know, but I really learned a lot from her, if that makes sense. And she kind of taught me a lot about the kind of corporate world, because this is my first experience, as I kind of mentioned earlier. So, you know, kind of jumping in with her and stuff and learning everything from scratch, basically. I learned everything from scratch. Not that I'm saying it's the best way of doing it, but this is the way that I'm only talking from my own experiences of like, I didn't go straight into an office or a creative agency, so I didn't learn any of that, if that makes sense. So it was a very different experience maybe to some design graduates who will go straight into agency and start working on campaigns and experimenting with different things. But I did have like, oh sorry, yeah.
Let's talk about that then, because I think a lot of people look at startups as the kind of be all and end all, and you go in and it's an amazing culture and it's fully formed and they've got their processes right, and it's a pool table and there's a ping pong table and there's you know, the bean bags. But actually startups can be super disorganized, and as you mentioned there, that was someone who was new to being an entrepreneur. They had a background in corporate, they'd exited to do something themselves. So what did that teach you about business and employment as that first kind of post, you know, that graduate paid experience?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. She was new to being an entrepreneur. She's probably new to even having like somebody like me on board and could help, you know, because like we had to, like the startup itself was a social enterprise, and they were almost like in between two brackets of two different industries. So they were social enterprise and a food and hospitality business, you know, and their plan was to sell kind of like frozen meals, if that makes sense, that were made in a kind of community kitchen. But then she had all these kind of corporate connections from her background, if that makes sense. So the idea was kind of like you know, at that time it wasn't really that big, but I suppose it's like the Hello Fresh kind of concept, you know, like, or Cooks or something like that. So you get your meals delivered to your house, that kind of thing. But operationally, that's like huge. Like, I mean, in hindsight now, I'm like, oh my God, I probably thought, oh, this lady totally knows what she's talking about, if that makes sense. But operationally, that is like the most difficult thing ever, because you have to have points where they can go and pick up the food and, you know, all these kinds of things. So like talking about, you know, how chaotic startup land is, if that makes sense. Like this lady didn't have a hospitality background. She had a very much a corporate kind of strategic sort of senior management sort of level, if that makes sense. So again, you know, just that balance of like understanding. I mean, after that, I also went to work in another startup. So it was like what I kind of discovered through all my experiences of starting out from graduating, I suppose, was working in the Feast community one, but then I was only working part-time with them, so obviously I had to balance like my funds so I could actually live and pay my rent and bills and stuff. So I ended up working with another startup, a creative startup called Collapsia, which was like a textiles kind of startup by a couple. And so it was really interesting, you know, they were kind of trying to experiment with the whole kind of sustainable you know, like slow making, if that's the way to describe it.
Slow fashion.
Slow fashion, yeah, sorry, slow fashion, yeah, that's probably the right term for it. So, you know, again, but learning all these things, like, I guess when you're in that sort of environment of working with entrepreneurs, you know, they've got so many things in their heads. And even I'm learning that as a new kind of business owner. This is the first time, like, since, well, we'll come into that later, but, you know, I guess, like, that was the thing of, like, learning from them, was that it was so chaotic at times. And then you've always got budgets to think about, and you're actually trying to think what is going to be of most value at that time as well. So it can be, it's really, and all people that become entrepreneurs are such different characters. I mean, I definitely think there's like something in them that keeps them going, if that makes sense. But there is like different, you know, they have different approaches and they're almost learning themselves. So you're almost, you know, I'm not saying it's a good or bad way of doing it, if that makes sense, but it's a very different structure to working in an office and working in an established business, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that we advise graduates to do, is to try and do an internship somewhere. Certainly when I was starting out as an older graduate at 30, I knew that the right internship with AAI could mean that I could go in somewhere for 3 months or 6 months, take on a whole load of diverse responsibilities, learn what I like, learn what I'm good at, and more importantly, learn what I don't like, so that when I finish that short-term placement, I'm equipped with so much ammunition to go into my next job interview and say, look, I've done this, I've survived under this kind of pressure, I've seen these kind of red flags in the workplace, these are what my boundaries are, these are what my values are. So did you feel, after coming out of those two opportunities, did you feel more rounded about what kind of professional you wanted to be?
It's funny, because at one point I did really feel like I was a jack of all trades. You know, I'd learned so many skills, and I knew that people needed the skills I had. I think we were talking about this before, Nick, but you know, like the skills I knew that this is kind of like how I accidentally ended up in consultancy, if that makes sense. But it was almost like I knew that people needed my skills, and especially startups, because their financials are all over the place. You know, they don't really know how their cash flow is going to be, if that makes sense. So it's quite difficult for them to stay steady, if that makes sense. I think if you're trying to identify where a good start, you know, I mean, a good startup environment to go and work for would be, you know, it's almost understanding what their long-term aims and objectives would be, you know, and their vision and how they're going to make that happen, because they might be trying to do way too much at once, as you'll have probably seen. And that would be like, not that I'm saying like now, I'm almost like, I can kind of identify now, probably from experience, like where something doesn't really seem that practical, and it might be, you know, I mean, kind of going into a burning hole. You know, it's like, and but it's also like, is this also fitting with my values of where I want to go? You know, does this fit with my vision? Is this something an organization I can get behind and help, you know, steer? And actually, you have to have, I think, a lot of initiative in a lot of ways to really help to be part of the business, to help it grow and to help it scale. Otherwise, you know, you can't be too, I don't think you can be complicit in a small organization, if that makes sense, because there's so many jobs that you have to juggle and do. But it is like a balance of like not knowing, of knowing like when it's maybe sitting with you as a person and not maybe, you know, I think my well-being definitely suffered at times. And I'll be really honest and authentic about that, because there was times where I was like, oh, this is just really chaotic, if that makes sense, and like I have no idea what the direction is that I'm kind of going in. And I ended up working, like as I was saying earlier, about working like with different kind of new businesses, you know, because I think at that time there was probably the rise of kind of entrepreneurial businesses was starting to come around in Edinburgh. Maybe now there's like, I have no idea, I think there's probably so much more than there was maybe at the beginning, but now there's, at that time anyways, it was almost like starting to, you know, this kind of entrepreneurial culture was almost at the starting point, I would say. So for me, I ended up going to work with, I guess like from learning sort of different tools, digital tools and digital platforms, I realized that I could adopt that skill set every single time that I went into any organization. And that's something I learned very, very quickly off the bat. You know, as I said, like I kind of grew up in sort of like the beginning of social media. I'm not saying, you know, at the beginning, but like some of the platforms that were coming out at the time and understanding how to utilize them. And, you know, for startups, social media is an amazing tool to have. Like, well, I mean, any business now really needs some kind of digital presence. At that time, it wasn't that I think as necessary maybe in 2014, but now it's like such a necessary thing. So learning kind of digital skills very, very early on and applying my kind of creative, kind of visual, you know, knowledge to that, if that makes sense, really, really kind of brought it all together, you know, and I could visualize campaigns, I could understand all the components, but then the thing that I made to realize what made it valuable, if that makes sense, for clients was to build up their data quite early on. And that was really where I kind of realized that was where I became really interested, I suppose, in digital really early on, actually. And it was like learning that skill set. I was working with a restaurant I still work with them actually. So I work with a restaurant called Tuk Tuk Indian Street Food, and they wanted to expand as a casual dining brand. So for me, working with them, and when they decided to scale up and open up another restaurant in Glasgow, I honestly had so many opportunities for them, if that makes sense. It was really exciting because I got to develop like a product line, I got to design like a website from scratch, you know, all these kinds of things, which you don't often get the opportunity to do as a junior, I would say. You know, you're usually part of a team, whereas I did all of that stuff from scratch. I wouldn't say I did it perfectly in any way. Like there's always that person where you're like, oh God, they got an intern to come in and make their website. Oh God, it was a bloody mess, if that makes sense. But you know, that's where I guess it was really interesting for me, because I learned so much from scratch. And that was really where I think like the crutch of like making all the mistakes that I did, you know, can't say that you make it perfect every single time, but I learned lots of different ways and lots of different methods, and eventually found methods that worked for the organizations that I worked in. And so that's, I guess, you know, from working in startup and working in small businesses, SMEs, it was very challenging. I kind of got to a point where I decided that I would go, and I guess this is me coming into like me going into a job, like my first proper job, which is kind of hilarious if that makes sense. But me going into my first proper job in an agency, and I started that, oh, it was like 3 years ago now, if that makes sense. And that was such a cultural shock for me, actually.
Tell me about it then, because you've had all this freedom working on different projects and the freedom
yeah,
to kind of explore your own skills, and then you're brought into a place which is, it's a PR agency. It's got very regimented hierarchy, line management, how they like to go about looking after their clients. Their brand identity is already very defined. So you're coming in as a staff member, but at the same time, you know they've hired you for your skills and what you're representing. So there's this weird balance of play by the rules, but also shine.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, definitely. You know, I mean, I think I kind of got to the end of like working, like, cause I've been working with Tuk for like years and years and years, and then working for myself and doing loads of different projects in that time. I was actually working on various projects as a freelance. Like when I first almost emerged from university, I basically went straight into freelance life, you know, because even my Feast community internship was self-employed, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that was the first time, you know, imagine coming out of university and just being like, oh my God, I've got to learn about my accounts and all that kind of stuff. It's really like, it's quite full on, you know, and even at that age. So, you know, when I went into like my first ever proper job of working in agency, and you know, it was really insightful for me. But like, I guess like the structure was very different because I had a 9 to 5 job. I had to wear work clothes every day, which was always like, oh God, I got to dress up every day, you know. But like, I guess you know, kind of coming back to my experiences of working in agency, you know, it almost felt like a little startup in its own way because it was a small team. It wasn't a big team, like 8 of us in there, 2 managing directors, and I guess like they were quite a traditional kind of corporate PR agency as well. So again, you know, there were some values there that sat with me quite well because I definitely wanted to get structure. Like that was what I was looking for at the time. I was like, I want structure and I want to learn how it's done properly, you know, learn all the basics of, you know, what it's like to work in a team as well, because working on your own is really hard. I don't think we really mentioned that, but that was sometimes the loneliest thing, is like one thing that I found really hard of like just working client facing all the time as a freelancer. It's a really lonely kind of experience. I mean, that's why I did, and I guess Nick, you'll kind of know this, but I did so much networking, you know, throughout the years. And when I moved, like I ended up moving, I forgot to kind of say, but when Tuk decided to scale up and moved from Edinburgh to Glasgow, I moved to Glasgow basically for work. So that was the reasons that I kind of chose to move to Glasgow. It kind of made sense at the time. And I was like, yeah, living in Glasgow would be great if that makes sense. So, oh, sorry, 2 seconds.
It's all right. So I'm interested in this because I think a lot of people go through that phase of they're doing stuff for themselves or they're working on different projects, and that can be passion projects, and they can feel that they are developing these tools, but then you almost have to go to a 9 to 5 to sharpen those tools. But with that comes the constraint of a 9 to 5. Yes, you're getting a set salary, but like you say, you're ironing shirts, you're in the Zara business department picking out your outfits. It's not got that freedom. And you mentioned there the difference between company values and your own values when you've been working that way. So can we talk a little bit about kind of discovering your values by fitting into a bigger company's boxes? Like, what was your experience there of your comfort zones and identifying what worked and didn't work for you in terms of business values?
Yeah, I think I was just taken a little bit aback, if that makes sense. Actually, values-wise, probably me and my organization did look actually quite matched on paper, if that makes sense. And, you know, the direction that they wanted to go in, if that makes sense. But I think they were almost like, they were starting to form like a small digital team, you know, and starting to form like a new team within a quite traditional, you know, like I said, it was traditional PR communications agency, and they've not really ever done digital before, you know. So bringing in that kind of digital arm and structuring a new team, which, you know, you don't have any sort of anybody who's quite senior in that organization who's maybe strategically done it and brought in a digital team, that is quite a big challenge, if that makes sense, because you're almost teaching them about how digital needs to be run, if that makes sense, and you know, how does digital work in the context of their industry as well. So for me, that was where it was a little bit jarring at times, and maybe didn't feel like, you know, how can, you know, there's only so much, you know, you feel like your hands are kind of tied behind your back a little bit, if that makes sense. If you can't explore and you can't, like, you know, get, like, sometimes there is a case like they want kind of tried and tested methods, and that's hard to do in digital actually, and creative actually, because you're always kind of, you know, you're having to try and find like that little edge that you can kind of, before you step across it, if that makes sense, that it's not going to, you know what I mean, explore. And that's where entrepreneurs are always like breaking down barriers, aren't they, at the end of the day, or, you know, breaking, you know, and that's what can be really exciting about working in that space. But working in an agency or working in a kind of established business is so different.
They're much more risk averse, aren't they? And with that comes shackles and handcuffs as to how you can solve problems. And I think if you've been a natural problem solver your whole life, even in your studies or in, you know, hospitality or so on, if you enjoy being quick to respond and solve problems, when you're then put in a framework where solving a problem actually takes weeks and weeks and weeks because it all needs checks and balances, it's incredibly stifling and can easily learn to burn out and doubting yourself and your skills and just not feeling like you've got that right fit anymore. So is that kind of what you discovered about your own values and your own worth in that role?
Yeah, definitely. And I think like it's not that it wasn't, actually I thought that having some boundaries was really good for me as well. Like I wouldn't have said those were negatives actually. In some ways they were actually really helpful to have some boundaries where we could collectively brainstorm with the team. And actually that's the things that I probably missed the most of working for myself now, is having that kind of collective brainstorming, or, you know, having somebody to double check your work, which is always really helpful, you know. And sometimes you don't get that as a freelancer or working in startup land. They'll just be like, yeah, that's fine, and just go ahead and, you know, get it done. Whereas it can be, I think that's where you need peers sometimes to, if you decide to go out on your own, or to, you know, work in a kind of startup sector, to find other people who work in the same industry as you, so that you have somebody that you can bounce ideas off sometimes, because it is hard. It's really challenging. But I do think that, you know, I enjoyed the fact, like in hindsight, it was frustrating, if that makes sense. But it has actually taught me a lot about process with clients and actually managing their expectations, and, you know, kind of sometimes taking things back a little bit rather than just agreeing to do everything, if that makes sense as well. So that can sometimes happen in startup land quite often, I would say, than so much than working in a kind of corporate environment where, yeah, you have to be risk adverse and you have to think about the frustrations that are in there and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Well, let's move on, because spoiler alert, you ended up quitting that job because of burnout. And then just as you quit, very bad luck that the coronavirus came along and basically meant there was no jobs. And you were one of the very unfortunate people that weren't in work when the furlough scheme came along. So you fell in between the gaps of the furlough scheme. So first of all, tell me about the decision to leave your work, if you can, and go into that as much as you want, and then how you felt when you realized there was no jobs and this pandemic probably wasn't going away anytime soon.
No, it was really, really crazy in so many ways. Actually, like during my job, I'm being very, very honest here, but I knew like halfway through my job, there was a few things that kind of happened during that time. And I knew that I was kind of suffering from like depression for a little bit, you know, during like the second year, I think I was in my job. And I went on antidepressants and it was fine, but it was one of those things of like, when I decided to quit my job, I was like, I think this is a big factor of my well-being and my mental health, if that makes sense. It's not making me happy anymore. I decided to save quite a fair bit. So it wasn't like, I guess I had put away a fair amount of savings because I knew there was getting to a point where I was like, I'm ready to leave now, if that makes sense. Like I'm ready to leave this job and I'm ready to just kind of have a break and focus on my mental health for a bit. And that was kind of the main decision that I decided to leave my job, if that makes sense. It wasn't really anything to do with the work. I actually really loved the clients we worked with and the campaigns that we were running and everything like that. But I just knew that mentally I wasn't like feeling amazing, you know, I just knew I was at burnout basically. I was really, really exhausted. I was really unhappy, and I was like, there's not really any other solution right now. This is the thing that's kind of causing that. So when I quit my job, basically, I quit it at the beginning of March, I think it was. Was it March? Yeah. And that's when the pandemic basically kicked in. And yeah, I was in this weird loophole because there was a lot of people, if you quit your job within a certain time frame, that basically you weren't entitled to any, I mean, it was chaotic for everybody, I'm sure. Like, I'm sure everybody can empathize here. It's like everybody was in a really chaotic position of like, you know, you wouldn't be entitled to furlough unless you were like in a full-time job, and that would be at the decision of your management putting you on furlough. But actually now, like in hindsight, there's lots of issues about putting people on furlough in some ways. I mean, it's probably been beneficial to some organizations, but there is still a lot of issues about putting people on furlough. And at that time, you know, my work weren't willing to put me on furlough, which is understandable because they still have to pay like national insurance contributions and all that, you know, all the other things that kind of come with that, holidays and things like that. So it's not like it's just free money that the government gives you to have somebody, if that makes sense. But it did leave me in a position where I was like, oh my gosh, it's crazy. I've left my job. I've now only got my savings to kind of live off, if that makes sense. And there may not be any opportunities for any, you know, there wasn't very, like, everybody was losing their jobs at that point, you know, and everybody's being made redundant. It was crazy. Everything was closing. And it still is continuing to be like that at the moment. You know, people are facing redundancy left, right, and center right now. And so I think that there is a big challenge in that respect of how we'll keep people in jobs, I suppose. So for me, when I left, it's kind of ironic because I actually wanted to take a break, and then that just did not happen.
Then the whole world wanted to take a break.
Yeah, I wanted to take a break, but basically the world wouldn't let me have a break. I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to work now, because they were like, oh, you've quit your job, that's fantastic. You're available to work, if that makes sense. And it was, I guess I was very lucky. Like I said before, I was quite a keen networker from the beginning. And because I moved cities like several times, like I moved from Dundee to Edinburgh to Glasgow, I guess when I first moved to Glasgow, I didn't know anybody here at all, if that makes sense. Like, I knew people, but I didn't really know people. And I guess the way that I kind of got to meet other local businesses or other entrepreneurs was by networking mostly. And so like by going to events and things like that, I kind of got connected with different people. I hosted a lot of networking events myself, so that could kind of mean that I could invite people to come along. But I think as soon as I basically went self-employed, or I wasn't even planning to really go self-employed, it just kind of happened because everybody was like, well, we need digital skills, basically. And that's why I guess digital for me is like such an important thing now. Like, that's basically like the main service that I kind of offer, but then combining my previous experiences of working as a digital consultant in a PR agency. So that's from a communications perspective, I guess, but then also working in kind of startup land. You know, I think like it had multiple skills that I could offer to people, if that makes sense. So now in the last year or something like that, I was trying to think about how many clients that I've actually worked with in the last year, but I've probably worked with at least 20 already. And that's been a variety of projects. You know, I've worked on big brand projects to like startups, but these startups are definitely more in the corporate sector. You know, they're not really super creative, if that makes sense, and maybe going for the, not saying low-hanging fruit as such, but it's a little bit of a different kind of demographic that they're going on. They're not like small startup businesses. They're like ones that want to scale to corporate size.
Yeah, so they're aggressively looking to grow, and they want to get their offering, the digital offering, the communications, their branding right from the get-go.
Exactly. Yeah, they've got that positioning that they want to get right straight from the bat. And I guess like that's the thing that I can kind of offer to the clients that I currently work with, if that makes sense, because I've worked in corporate you know, PR and communications, if that makes sense, and working with a range of all different kinds of like established SMEs through that agency I worked with, if that makes sense. And then my previous experience of working in kind of small startup is that I know how to work lean, you know, I can work agile, I can kind of contribute in lots of different kinds of ways. So I think that I offer quite a multitude of different skill sets, but that sometimes like it can be challenging because I'm almost like, it's like I can provide like a small team with a team of like 3 because I can do graphic design work, I can do comms work, if that makes sense, and I can do, you know, digital, if that makes sense. So it's
But this is all stuff that you've kind of picked up along the way. It's not things that you got from your degree or online courses, so to speak. It's just you've done it out of necessity and muddled through, made mistakes. But I think there'll be a lot of people on the call who are maybe looking to get into work, or they're graduating, or they're looking to change career completely, and they think, I don't have the tools, I don't have the qualifications, but they have the motivation, they have the urgency, and they have the desire. So what would you say to them about imposter syndrome and kind of comfort zones? Did you have any words of wisdom?
Yeah, well, I mean, talking about being self-taught in a lot of ways, you know, like I think I did teach myself a lot of my digital skills, but I mean, talking about digital softwares and things like that, I mean, there is a lot of like learning tools, like, you know, I mean, like there's lots of resource websites now that are available if you want to learn. Like I learned like digital analytics, like Google Analytics very early on, and probably when it was still like kind of a new thing. And for me, that was really, really helpful because I could understand, you know, if we ran a campaign, for example, or if we were trying to identify, I think these are like basic skills now, possibly for, I don't know, for anybody, if that makes sense, but they weren't at that time. But I actually think if I was telling somebody to maybe start off, maybe looking at doing something like Google Analytics or, you know, a digital skills training course, because actually I think it's really fundamental now for like any, it doesn't matter what industry that you go into. And that's where, you know, it means that I've become quite resilient, I suppose, in lots of different ways for the different industries I work in, because I can apply it. It doesn't matter what, I worked in salmon farming, I've worked in like financial, you know, and I've worked in like, you know, food and drink. It's all, but literally everything that I've done is all carried through regardless of like the industry that I've kind of worked in. So I would probably say if anybody was looking to, you know, shape or sharpen up their skills in their sort of CV or what they could offer to a new employer, I would definitely say like looking at broadening your digital skills or your comm skills are probably the key ones I would kind of go to. But
yeah, and we quite like the Google Digital Garage courses, don't we? They're all completely free, and they've got a massive range of different kind of entry-level marketing courses that people can just get for free.
They were brilliant, actually. They used to have one at the Mitchell Library in Glasgow, and they had one in Edinburgh, I think, at Newmarket. They were great, actually. And I went along to a lot of free courses and free workshops, if that makes sense. Even like I was saying to you today, I was on a workshop with BIMA Scotland, and that was about user research, you know. So I'm always like trying to brush up my skills. Can't always go to workshops as much as I'd like to these days, but I tried to maybe join. There's another one called General Assembly, which does a lot of free workshops as well for digital skills. So even if you just want to brush up on like slightly knowing about SEO, for example, or something like as a baseline, those kinds of tools can be quite useful to just kind of keep going as you're learning, I suppose.
Yeah, and I suppose that leads me on to talking about the reality of freelance work then. After you acquired all these skills, you know, the Panny D was happening, there was no money coming in. You pulled the trigger on setting yourself up as a business and going from this kind of nomadic freelance life to being a business of yourself. You have businesses on retainer, clients on retainer. What is the freelance like actually like? Because you keep telling me, Nick, you'd love it, off you go and be a freelancer, but it's like, well, how do you start that process? How do you go, right, today, yesterday I wasn't a freelancer, today I'm in business? How does that start? What does it look like?
Well, I can only talk from my own experiences. Mine was chaotic. You know, the first time around I started as a freelancer was really, like I said, just quite like crazy. It was really sporadic because I kind of dipped into startup land and learning that those people needed the services I could offer. And then I think then going to work in agency for me, I kind of learned that some clients could be on retainer, for example, you know, and they need ongoing services. But also, maybe even before my agency time, is that I kind of act almost like, I guess the way that I sell my services now or act as my business is that as a consultant, I guess you're always selling your time as a consultant anyways, but I almost act as an in-house employee. you know, so, but it means that they've got the client gets the advantage because they don't have to worry about holidays and, you know, all the other things that come with employing somebody, but they may need like the skills and the knowledge that I have, and I actually can bring a lot more to the table because I work with lots of different clients. I'm not just working in-house. So it's like, it's quite nice. It's quite, I enjoy it. I guess it's not for everybody. Some people just want to be stuck working on one thing, if that makes sense. Whereas for me, I quite enjoy the fact that I get to work across lots of different industries, and you do that in agency land as well. But I think for me, working like across like lots of different clients, you know, I have a couple who are on retainer, if that makes sense. So I work with a client called Physiomedics, who are really fantastic. They are like a SaaS, which we call a software as a service company. So they're a technology company, and they basically sell digital triage consultations, but they're working with, you know, their aspiration is to kind of go out and sell to massive like corporate, you know, big name healthcare companies, if that makes sense, you know, which is really exciting for them. And it's really nice to be part of that journey. So in some ways, although I'm a consultant and I'm a contractor for them, I'm almost like their marketing manager as well. So I get like both titles, which is the fun part, if that makes sense. But I can also have the independence and freedom. You know, I don't need to be there at 9 every single day, right up until 5. But there is like a balance of like working between, you know, working for yourself and working with clients and making sure that they've got the things that they need, and actually like herding them in a little bit as well, because there can be, you know, just like in any startup really, or any organization, probably just even any organization, there's always like some sort of, you know, that you've got to kind of plan for, and making sure that everybody, project managing basically, and managing people as well. It's can be challenging in so many different aspects, but I suppose there's not a one size fits all for that, is there?
Well, that's it.
Let's just work.
But I think even just hearing you talk about this has shown people what it can be like. And you mentioned there, you're essentially selling your time. What has this last year, working with different clients, building up your resilience and putting yourself out there, what has that taught you about your own time and how you value it and your work-life balance now, away from the 9 to 5?
I think everybody's just worked harder than they ever have this year, to be honest. I think that's why it's this year, the pandemic has made things so different, because it might have been totally different if there, like, just say, for example, there hadn't been a lockdown and I'd left my job and I decided to go and start up a business, and then I'd be meeting my clients, you know, in their office. I actually went to one of my clients' offices on Friday, and that was such a nice thing to do because I've been working with them for quite a while, and I've not actually met everybody I've worked with this year, I've not actually met in person, which is so bizarre. You know, and I guess that's the thing of like thinking about, you know, working for yourself. I suppose there is like a, you know, how do you, you know, just like we were saying there, Nick, is like, how do you kind of, you know, go out there, oh, sorry.
We've all got people in our houses at the moment. So we lost Laura for a second.
Sorry,
it's all good.
Partner.
it's the reality of working from home. We've got a question in from Rachel, Laura, if you want to take that. We've got a couple of questions coming in just while we've got some time. So Rachel wants to know, how did you decide what you wanted your business to be? Like what the perimeters of your business were, I think, you know, how it's presented, what services you were going to do, and what the first steps were for setting that up. So again, people are just so interested in like how you actually define your service offering to the world.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess, you know, defining what my service offering was is that, I guess if you look at my website now, I realized when I started this consultancy business that basically I wanted to be like a strategic advisor. And because I've built up so much business knowledge, it's not just like I'm a branding expert or like designer, or, you know, communications person. I've actually got a lot of business knowledge now because I've watched entrepreneurs with their struggles, you know, their problems, all that kind of stuff, how they've gone for funding, investment. Actually, most of the work that I've done this year is like writing investment decks, if that makes sense. Wow. So, you know, like that's all I've done. Most of it has been writing investment decks, you know, that are pitching for large amounts of money, if that makes sense. Like because these startups are, like I said, are scaling to phenomenal high amounts. So a lot of it is really kind of like taking all that kind of entrepreneurial knowledge I know and then helping organizations. But it meant that I had to change the clients I had as well, you know? Like, I think when you start up, you're like, yeah, I want to work in a place, like you said, with a pool table or something, you know? I actually think that's all very vapid, personally. Maybe that's not, that some people want that, which is great, you know, maybe working in like an environment like that where it's really fun and playful and stuff, but actually I just don't think it really balances out, you know, like if you're planning to do that for yourself as an individual and actually identifying the kind of clients that you want to work with. I knew from the get-go that I wanted to work in kind of like businesses that had a lot of purpose or wanted to create positive change within their organizations, you know, like from the get, like if they didn't, and I think like you can quickly identify whether that is not like for you, if that makes sense. Like there's some really small startups out there, you know, that'll be selling products or whatever. They're not really the kinds of clients that I would personally want to go for, if that makes sense. Because some people want to work in kind of like really cool, trendy, like lifestyle campaigns, if that makes sense. And you're doing all that really fun, like I'm selling clothes or fashion campaigns and stuff. But like that's not for everybody, if that makes sense. And for me, I usually find those clients don't have masses of budget. So it's not really like the kind of campaign that I'm themselves in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's strong. That's good advice. We've got a couple of questions coming in about internships, which we can try and smash out in the last couple of minutes. So you mentioned right at the start that you self-initiated your internships. I think this goes back to kind of putting yourself out there and creating opportunities. And similarly, someone's asking about internships in the creative industry after a break. So they're both about putting yourself out there and finding opportunities and making it happen for you. Do you have any advice about that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, like I said, kind of earlier, you know, about how you successfully self-initiate like an internship. I would definitely say that it's kind of like looking for organizations that you might be interested to work for and just go and have a look on LinkedIn is like one of my favorite platforms now. It used to not be, especially as a creative person. Like LinkedIn is like the most non-creative place ever. Although I do think that there's now, it's changing a little bit. I think that it's great to see more creatives on LinkedIn. But I do think that if you're kind of going out there to network, if that makes sense, you might want to start looking for somebody who might be in the role, like so it might be creative director or something like that, and kind of reaching out to them. But I guess it's also thinking about, well, what do I want to learn or what do I want to bring to that organization as well? You know, is there something, there'll be something that particularly attracts you to that organization, I think, in the first place that you might consider about self-initiating an internship, for example. So, you know, I think if you kind of summarize, like I think kind of reaching out personally to people to even ask for feedback is a nice way to get, you know, not saying not everybody has time to do that, if that makes sense, and you will get lots of knockbacks and lots of rejections, but sometimes just asking for help is like the best way to kind of, you know, approach somebody, if that makes sense, you know. And even if you say to them, maybe you might not get something out of it, but you might just be like, well, could you give me some feedback on my portfolio or my CV, and what could I do to improve this? And I think even just doing that initial reach out is actually like the biggest step forward.
Yeah. So you've segued me nicely to talk about something we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, which is social media for job seekers, personal branding, and how to get the most out of LinkedIn. I want to pick up on one key thing here that you said, talking to people. So last week when we did the passion projects thing, we mentioned just creating a bit of distance from what you've been doing and talking to people about it. They can actually help you to reframe it. So you've come up with this title, a creative strategist, which is the umbrella title for all of the skill sets that you've picked up over the years. And I think sometimes we're all so close to the things we've done and are good at, it's actually really hard to get perspective on it. So just picking up the phone or finding a coach or a mentor or someone that you look up to, someone who's maybe a couple of years ahead of you in their career in something that you want to do, and reaching out to them and being like, do you have 15 minutes to talk on a Zoom call? I just want to tell you about my experiences and where I kind of feel like I might be going. You know, people are actually a lot more receptive to that than you might think. And like you say, you'll get loads of knockbacks, but there are a lot of really nice people around that want to share their experiences. And if there's one thing I've learned this year, we're going to get deep here, Laura, to finish. Are you ready? If there's one thing I've learned, it's that Yeah, it's this. Yeah. It's that when you help people, it's almost like a selfish energy because you get so much from it yourself. If you're able to kind of something which is really easy for you to give, like a bit of advice, a bit of value, a bit of perspective, it's actually so gratifying to you because you feel like, oh, I've contributed to someone's life today, and it's reassuring of your own value. So if you learn how to approach people right, they're usually going to have the time of day for you. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's where, you know, you have to be really open-minded to learn about different perspectives as well, you know. I've obviously talked a lot about how I really think that diversity in digital is so important as well, you know, and we've talked a lot about that in the past. It's kind of that you can always bring, I think, bringing different ideas and different concepts to the table as well, because you'll always learn something from somebody, even if they're super junior to you. Or, you know, one thing I really enjoyed was like I almost did you know, working with people who are much older than me, if that makes sense. Like, you know, and I've learned so much from them, you know, in so many different ways. It's like, and I think that kind of helps to shape up like your perspective of how you work with others, if that makes sense. So yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, we've run out of time. My children are crying in the background, which means it's time for us to wrap this up.
I got a sandwich on my doorstep as well, but I saw there's a couple of extra questions here.
Yeah, Patricia's one's about non-face-to-face networking, and we're going to cover that in detail when we do the LinkedIn episode. So it's okay with you, Patricia. We'll wrap it up because I need to be on another meeting right now on this very same Zoom. So I need to go.
Yeah, just one last thing. I guess if anybody wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, or they want 50 minutes with me to just share like where they're at with their business or their career or, you know, anything, I'm more than happy to do that. So you can find me. I'll pop my, I think if you just Google or look at me for LinkedIn, then you can find me there. So that would be great. I'd love to connect with more people always.
There you go. It's all about connection and connectivity. Laura, thank you so much for your time today, your wisdom. I hope it was in some way kind of cathartic to talk about it. I'll just invoice you for the therapy and we'll take it from there. So guys, thank you so much for joining us, and we won't see you next week. We'll see you again on the 4th of May for a bumper episode where we'll look at cover letters and job interviews. And that's all about personal branding and being comfortable with yourself as well. So you can hopefully see how all these themes are kind of coming together. We're pulling in bits of expertise from all around the houses. And look, once again, thank you so much, Laura, for your time today. And we'll maybe see you again on an AAI webinar.
Amazing. Right. Thanks so much, everybody. Okay, take care now.
Bye.